I do not know why I chose to wake up and do this, but I am going to do it until I cannot or I don't want to anymore. I have in my archive on Substack a lot of papers I wrote when I was studying the ancient Near East in college and outside of college. And there's a lot of interesting things that I have not really dove back into, and there's a lot of things that I find that are super interesting, and I think maybe you guys would enjoy. And it's kind of a nice break from, I don't know, talking about strictly Catholicism and the Protestant theology and my journey from that to that or whatever. And yeah, so the topic of the first one is the origins and the existence of Satan, the serpent, and the light bringer. This was a super interesting paper to write because we grow up, and if you're in America, either Protestant or Catholic, well, let's just see. I always tie something back to that. But the way that I grew up, Satan's a guy with red horns. Satan's this evil person. Satan's this tempter. Satan is the one who, you know, does evil to you. Satan became this like almost omniscient, omnipotent thing, counterpart to God, where everything bad that happens is Satan or his demons or something like that. So it was always a question in my mind of like, where do we get our theology from, around Satan? Where do we get our theology around the serpent? Are they the same? Is the serpent in Genesis the same as the serpent that is later seen, the big one in Revelation and stuff? All these theological ties started appearing. And so I wanted to explore the origins of Satan and serpent and what we can know without going to the extent that surpasses what's in Scripture. So, like, drawing the barrier, obviously there's going to be some speculation and biblical theology that we're going to try to tie together. And I actually am looking at the paper that I wrote, and so as I work through this, I'm going to see, like, has my thoughts changed? And what do I know now? Has anything in my readings in the last, I wrote this in 2018, so 6 years ago, has anything changed? Has anything developed? So, yeah, we're going to start with what we know and kind of like what I talked about, like what I grew up understanding of him is found in 2 Corinthians 11:14. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So right away, we kind of know he's not this Hollywood perception of the devil, right? Well, could be, but he disguises himself as an angel of light. You can take this many different ways, and I'll kind of leave that on you guys. Paul exhorted the Corinthians not to go beyond what was written, so that's the barrier of the paper that I put in here of like, okay, let's try not to speculate too much. Let's see what we can drive thought-wise from our knowledge of the Scriptures and the surrounding text. So who is the serpent? Number one question, right? Genesis 3:1 clarifies the serpent was an animal among others. The serpent, the Nakash, was craftier than all other creatures of the field. In response to the serpent's deception, God says, "Cursed are you more than all other livestock, and more than all the creatures of the field. And on your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat." Genesis 3:14. So it's clear that the serpent in Genesis, right off the bat, is a creature. It's crafty. It is now cursed by God, the most cursed thing of all livestock. And since this curse functions, it concerns other animals, it is best read that the serpent is a literal snake. So, like, it's when it's talking about livestock and it's using the terminology that it's using, it's clearly a physical snake. It's not a perception of a snake. It's not an embodiment of a snake. It's not a figurative language being used. It is the reality is that it is like another animal. It's livestock. Isaiah recalls this curse in an end time vision in which the snake is just another animal again. The wolf and the lamb, they graze together. I don't have the reference. Isaiah 60? No, 65. So, yeah, the wolf and the lamb shall, I'll have to add that in here. The wolf and the lamb shall graze together, the lion shall eat straw like ox, and the dust shall be the serpent's food. So he's calling back to Genesis 3 when the dust is the serpent's food. And Isaiah didn't go, even in a vision, which often is fantastical in nature, he didn't go beyond what Genesis was when regarding the serpent. So Paul supports Genesis' description of the serpent animal in Corinthians. I'm afraid that as the serpent, so he's drawing back, deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. So he's warning against the same nature of the serpent that can be found in Genesis in his letter to the Corinthians. Conversing to the church that the Christians of at Rome right now, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. Romans 16:20. So, little prophetic there from Paul, which we don't often see or think about when we think about Paul being prophetic. Which, obviously is that reflection of, will bruise your head in Genesis 3:15. Paul's language is not parallel to the Greek version of Genesis 3:15. However, Paul states that God will crush Satan, but the Septuagint translates the Hebrew bruise, and Paul uses a different terminology. Now we know that the Septuagint was the Bible of the apostles. There is potential that Paul, of all of these people, is using different texts or translations that may not be the Septuagint. So remember, the disciples, they have their Old Testament, it's the Septuagint. Paul is in a different category, has access to different things. He is, higher up. He has access that they don't have. So I don't know. That's just throwing a thought out there. But what's most likely happening here is he's pulling on the Leviathan. So in Psalm 74, you crushed the heads of the dragons on the waters. You shattered the heads of the dragons. So the Hebrew term for dragon in these verses, is sea monster, Leviathan sequentially. To be sure, Satan is like the serpent in that, being a liar. See John 8. The devil tries to tempt, Matthew 4, Mark 1, Luke 4, Thessalonians 3, Revelation 2, and lead astray, Revelations 12, 20, 2 Corinthians 11. But these terms for Satan are not used for the serpent who deceives in Eden. So there's a little bit of a difference happening here. There's terms not being attributed to the one who deceives. There's the liar, the tempter. We're getting a very Job picture in the New Testament still, rather than the one who is directly deceiving. That word, I don't remember it in Greek right now, apatao, something like that. Is not used by Paul or the New Testament to describe like the one in Eden. So there's a little bit of a difference language-wise. That's it. So I'm not drawing the full dichotomy here yet. Genesis does not attribute the serpent to being Satan. It isn't until the last book of the Bible that we get any picture at all who the serpent is. So we go a very long time before we actually connect Genesis serpent in Revelation. So this whole time, Satan, Paul's not relating Satan and the serpent. He's relating the Leviathan in Psalms. He is so there is a dichotomy here, and there's a line being drawn, at least, where Paul's references are Psalms. Paul's references about Satan are not in Genesis so far. So who is Satan or the devil, right? Are they the same? Are they different? Are they, we have some of these questions appearing now. And keep in mind, obviously we have that thought in the back of our head, remembering that Christ fulfills all knowledge as well as the sacraments, as well as the Old Testament laws, some of them, and the prophecies and all these things. So it's possible that we'll find that Jesus fulfills the knowledge of the devil, right? Or maybe he'll continue to draw that line between the serpent in Genesis and the Jobian, is that a word? It is now. Jobian version of Satan. So the great dragon was cast out, the serpent of old, called the devil and Satan. So serpent of old, hold that in thought, who deceives the whole world. He was cast out to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. He laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for thousands of years. No, I'm sorry. Bound him for 1,000 years. So now in Revelation, that's Revelation 12:9 and 22. And so we're getting a cohesive connection now. Revelation describes a heavenly battle in which the great dragon was cast out, that ancient serpent called the devil and Satan. Now here's the problem. I don't have enough coffee. No. Here's the problem. That great serpent is the word. Oh, am I Donald Trump? The word being used there is not necessarily, like dragon is Leviathan. Dragon is pointing back to what Paul points back to, which is the Psalm. So it's not necessarily the serpent in Genesis 3:15. 3:15? Genesis 3. However, the Greek Septuagint also calls the serpent of the garden an ophis. So, the writer of Revelation may not be referring to the snake we meet in Genesis, like I just said. So there's clearly, like, in Revelation, we're getting this great serpent, the dragon, the great big thing. That's obviously the Leviathan in Psalms that Paul references. We don't yet have a reference directly to the serpent in Genesis 3. One clue that the Revelation may not be the snake in Eden because the source of John's language isn't Genesis, it's Isaiah. Again, pointing back to the prophets. Revelation first describes Satan as the dragon. The only other verse in Scripture that we see a creature who is called both dragon and serpent is in Isaiah's description of the primordial sea monster, Leviathan. So again, we're back at the Psalms. We're still not at the serpent in Genesis yet. And we may never get there. According to the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, Septuagint, the prophet states, "In that day God shall bring a holy and great and strong sword against the dragon, the serpent, that flees upon the dragon, the twisting serpent. God shall defeat the dragon." Isaiah 27. So again, since Isaiah resounds the word dragon and serpent several times in the verse, we can be confident that this is the very verse in which John is referring to in Revelation. Like I always say, and I'm saying it more today than ever, you cannot understand the New Testament unless you understand the Old Testament. That is the basis for all that Jesus did, one. Two, it is the basis for all of the New Testament writings. Everything is connected to the Old Testament, all the drawing upon, all the fulfillment. And when you understand that, oh my gosh, it's amazing. Like John 1:1 becomes this Genesis type open door of connecting the terminologies and fulfilling it. Oh, it's so cool. Okay. So, according to the original Hebrew text of Isaiah 27, the dragon will not stop at the end of the days, is called Leviathan. So, we still don't have that cunning serpent. Like, cunning serpent is like this like, you think cunning, right? You think Snape from Harry Potter. You're not thinking ginormous Leviathan, like this massive thing, right? So we still don't have this connection yet. The concept. Oh wait, no, I do want to put this out. It is in this ancient chaos creature, Leviathan, that John calls the devil and Satan in Revelation 12. rather the snake in the Garden of Eden. The dragon of Revelation is a primordial monster that embodies the forces of chaos and disorder. So draw back to Genesis 1. He's not articulating it in a way that we can connect it to the serpent. Yeah, the cunning serpent. And a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out. So again, the serpent of old, the great dragon, the Leviathan, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, he was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So it's like in your mind, you're obviously like, dude, that's obviously the serpent, the snake, right? But you can't get snake. I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit here. You can't get snake. You cannot imply the reference that they're not making. It's improper hermeneutics. It's not what we should do. So you can't directly say, oh, he's talking about the serpent, because the serpent is this human level serpent engaging in a conversation, and the devil's being depicted as the great Leviathan. Clearly different. And we have to ask ourselves, like, how does Satan get to this point, right? Where he's the mighty dragon. We can go back to the ruler of Tyre in Ezekiel 28, which is obviously there's debate around that. Ironside, Protestant commentator. It is very evident that of no earthly ruler could these words be spoken. Undoubtedly, we have the original condition in the fall of Satan himself. It was of him that God could say, "Thou sealest up the sum, full wisdom and perfect in beauty." Men often ask why God created the devil. The answer is he never created the devil. He created a pure spirit being of great wisdom and glory, but the spirit dared to conspire against the throne of God, and so the greatest of all angels became the arch enemy of God and man. So that's like the consensus thing that I grew up with right there. That the devil chose to defy the God of the universe, Adonai. And if you think about that for more than 5 seconds, it's bizarre. It's very bizarre. Think about being in the presence of God and being perfect in wisdom and in glory. And coming to the conclusion that you want to overthrow Adonai. If I'm being honest, I don't buy it. There has to be something else going on here. That's the conspiracy side of me. I don't know. That's why this paper is a working paper, because I don't know. I don't know everything. The text does something incredible for readers, though. It shows that God is showing. I'm under the assumption, and I think I can back this up historically through commentary, through text, through logic, and all these other things. I'm not going to do that right now, but I'm just going to hand my view over, which is in agreement with a lot of scholars, that the king of Tyre was being controlled by Satan. Okay, so that's what this next part kind of goes into. This text does not, or does something incredible for readers. It shows that God is showing that Tyre is under Satan's control, and God does something poetic. He speaks at Tyre. So he's like, this is speaking at Tyre, but what he does is kind of like raises his eyes, like I'm being metaphorical. He raises his eyes and is talking over Tyre into the eyes of Satan. Okay, his once perfect creation. He says, "Look at you who were and what you're becoming." Ezekiel 28 addresses two at once: the ruler of Tyre and Satan. The closing verses, as we mentioned, link to this great being so intimately with the literal Tyre, the king, and the angel who fell. So the question arises from there whether or not Satan embodied or was the transcending phenomenon behind the serpent in Genesis. So like we see now, if you agree that Satan is controlling Tyre, the king of Tyre, then you can say that this, here's the connection that I'm making finally, is you can say that he controlled the serpent, right? Because, okay, brain. The king of Tyre was punished even if he was not controlled by Satan. There were outcomes that happened because he was consumed by Satan. Just like the serpent, who was consumed by Satan, potentially, embodied by, metaphysically, and the serpent was cursed. Okay, so the being is still cursed, even if overtaken by Satan. I hope that makes sense. If that's the prevailing conclusion, then we can say that the true embodiment of Satan is then the Leviathan. And let's not rule out that the Leviathan is just a metaphysical interpretation, embodiment, because what they did in ancient Near East is they always try to embody the spiritual. So that's possible. So, anyways, getting back on the main thing, there is little evidence of this that Satan embodied a serpent in the garden. So, like, we don't really have great evidence of this. There is, however, a theological case that we can make that gives weight to the notion that Satan was, in fact, the serpent in Genesis. However, there is much to think about when it comes to the phenomenology of sin and of Satan. Some people like to link the two directly, like sin is Satan and Satan is sin, and that's because sin exists because of Satan. And one can't bear without the other. I don't think that you can do that, because it's like chicken before the egg. Like, chaos existed prior to that of Satan. And if you know anything about the ancient Near East, you know that chaos is basically the interchangeable term for what sin became. Chaos is this force that existed. We don't know, like, let's just be completely honest, we don't know why. There might be divine laws that we are unaware of that require chaos in order to exist, and God is over all of that, obviously. And when someone chooses chaos, they are choosing then that becomes sin. When they choose order, that becomes holiness. Does that make sense? Yeah. Like, how can something perfect, right? So he's made perfect. How can that become sin? The only explanation for that is that he chose to operate in chaos, in which becomes sin. There's a lot of questions. And to reference more of the Near East, to give us maybe a little bit better picture, the ancient Near East combat myth, the motif, Marduk and Tiamat in the Enuma Elish, shout out Carson, Baal and Yam and Mot in the ancient Canaan, typically depicted the bad guy as a serpent. So this idea of serpent is prevalent in the ancient Near East. And that extends into our history. So when you look at, like, the feathered serpent that visited people, like the Aztecs, serpent comes up all the time as someone full of wisdom. Now, don't forget, just because it's prevalent in the ancient Near East, if God chose that the Genesis writer would use serpent in an evil way, it's so that they would understand, like, the readers that God is arguing against. He's saying, hey, look, I'm going to use your terminology, serpent, and he uses it in a polemic nature. So Satan being a serpent might not even be reality. It may be the depiction that God chose to use because it's written in the ancient Near East, and that's what they know as the embodiment of evil is serpent, right? So just take note of that. That's very possible. Doesn't need to be literal, because the whole of the Old Testament is such a polemic against the other cultures. Yeah. So who is Lucifer then, right? We obviously know that Lucifer is a translational term from the in the King James version. Like it's not a term ever used in the original manuscripts or anything like that. Hallel means light bringer or morning star, which we see elsewhere in Scripture. So John Milton in the 1600s changed that to Lucifer, which is where we get the terminology Lucifer. So almost not worth even talking about. It is difficult to determine, though, at which point in Israel's history the accuser, found in Job, began to take on much more of a sinister role in their belief structure, right? Because if you look back at Job, Satan is an instrument of God. He hovers over the earth and he goes to God and is like, I haven't found any. What do I do? I'm bored. And God's like, go mess with Job. Watch what he does. Now, when God says go mess with Job, watch what he does or doesn't do, defy God, it is interesting because it's almost like God is showing. The argument could be made that Satan, though he defied God and left God, there is some divine order law that requires him to still get acceptance from the Lord in order to do things. Food for thought. I don't know. So, anyways, back to the accuser and how he became the sinister role in the Jewish thought, or how heaven's great persecutor, right? So he became the prince of darkness. So how does Job's persecutor, the heaven's council persecutor, get tied to the prince of darkness found in Ephesians 6? It's easy to make the connection between Israel's time in exile and the likely influence of the cosmic dualism of the Persian religion. And this is something that most scholars will point out pretty quickly. It's clear, however, that by the 1st century CE, Judaism developed a belief in the divine forces of darkness doing battle against the forces of light. So, this wasn't really, a thing heavily prevalent in the Hebrew thought until, the 1st century, after the Persian religion dualism kind of became a part of their understanding. And you'll see, and just if you're thinking, well, Jews, they don't adopt other cultures' things. That's their whole thing. Well, no, they do. When they walked out of Egypt with cattle, and they're like, we can't eat anything. They used to eat cattle all the time until they were in exile in Egypt, which they don't eat cattle in Egypt. So it's they definitely adopted cultural norms of wherever they were captivated by. The Greek word diablos, from which the devil is derived, meaning slanderer. So we get back to that persecutor thing, right? Comes from a verb that means to hurl accusations. What is this from? This is from a movie or something. Man, that's going to bother me. I did that, and it's definitely from a movie. Diablos was typically used as the Greek equivalent for the Hebrew Satan. So in the Septuagint version of Job, for example, though it was not uncommon to transliterate the word in Greek's Satanas, 1 Kings 11 is the usage there. So it's we get that connection between the Septuagint. Other names used for the leader of the forces of evil at this time included Mastama, which means hatred, which is in the Jubilees 10 and other writings, and Belial, a popular name among writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means worthless or corrupt. Children of Belial, so B'nai Bel, I think, actually is the actual terminology, even though I wrote down Belial, well, in Hebrew, was typically a phrase used to describe evil people in the Hebrew Bible. Deuteronomy 13 uses it, 1 Samuel 1, 2 Chronicles 13. If someone were searching for a name that personified evil in the Hebrew Bible, it would be Belial, not Satan. Okay? Because the usages were so frequent. Interesting enough, though, the name only occurs once in the New Testament in 2 Corinthians 6 as Paul's stark contrast to Christ. So there is a line between what is being used with Diabolos versus Belial, right? So that question arises. Throughout the Gospels, Satan's kingdom is never considered to be this burning underworld, by the way. So like there becomes this stark contrast, right? You know what? I kind of wanna pause here. So whoever is editing this video, pause here. I want to come back and conclude that last little thought a little bit deeper. Tony, I hope you're editing this. Okay, so the word devil comes from the Greek. I'm going to kind of repeat myself a little bit, but I'm going to get clear. The word devil comes from the Greek word diabolos, which means slanderer or accuser. This comes from a Greek verb that means to throw or hurl, like someone throwing accusations. So again, think Job. He's the accuser, right? He throws the accusations at Job. In ancient times, people used diabolos as translation of the Hebrew word Satan, which also means accuser. You see this in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, especially in books like Job, where Satan is shown as the accuser. But in ancient Jewish writings, Satan wasn't the only name used for evil. Wasn't even used for the word evil. There were other terms that were used. So, mastama, in the Book of Jubilees, hatred. The Dead Sea Scrolls uses the word mastama for hatred or evil forces. Belial is the most common, worthless, corrupt. It's found in Deuteronomy for Samuel and other references. Belial was the most commonly used in ancient Hebrew text rather than Satan to describe ultimate evil. So Satan actually is not connected linguistically to evil, but rather accuser. So we still are maintaining that Jobian understanding. Now, when the New Testament was written, the name Belial shows up once in 2 Corinthians 6:15. Paul, as an early Christian leader, used it to make a strong comparison between good and evil, saying that Christ represents good, while Belial stands for evil. And I want to look up, just real quick, because this just popped in my head. That's not the right app. Bear with me. Okay, so they don't even translate it in mine. They keep it Belial. Perfect. I didn't know if a translation... edit this out. I am looking for the translations, comparisons, of 2 Corinthians 6:15. I want to know who does it. If anyone does it. You can cut this whole darn thing out, by the way. I'm just looking for my own purposes. Okay, everyone keeps it Belial. Sweet. So, back to my thought. So we don't have a connection between Satan and evil. We have accusing every time. Accusing. We have, we potentially have Satan choosing chaos, which creates sin. So I'm not saying Satan isn't embodying sin or throwing sin or anything like that. That's definitely the highest potential. But we actually, in the New Testament, don't get that depiction of Satan being the Jobian Satan being evil. We still have the accuser being at the forefront. Throughout the Gospels, Satan's kingdom is never considered to be a burning underworld full of tormented dead, which, again, Hollywood, but rather is equated with the bondage of sin and the curses brought upon humanity for acts of unrighteousness. So, if you think about the bondage of sin and the curses brought upon yourself for the sins that you have committed, we've all committed sin, it's unrighteous and deserves justice, right? And the accuser's role is to bind sin to the unrighteous in Job. So according to Jesus in Matthew 12, Mark 3, and Luke 11, a strong man, Satan, must be bound in order to plunder his house for treasures, humans. And it is clear he viewed his ministry and that of his disciples within this context. So we've established various points of Satan in this realm, right? The serpent and what the Bible teaches. We don't connect. We don't have a connection between Genesis 3's serpent and Satan, technically. What we have is connections to the Leviathan and the big monster and the great monster in Revelations to Isaiah and the other mentions of him. We started with a thought on Genesis and the serpent. Was this a literal serpent, or was it a way of conveying that Satan was present and enticing Eve? Ezekiel 28 tells us that it is possible that Satan was once the guardian of Eden. It is also possible that Satan is standard angelic form, enticed Eve, and she related him to this cunning. The author then took the ancient Near Eastern understanding of the embodiment of chaos, which we see elsewhere in the ancient Near East. Every time it is a serpent, so they're like, okay, we're going to use serpent because this is what the culture understands. This is what they understood because they're ancient Near East. It's also possible that Satan, though all this is obviously now in speculation, but these points that I'm making should provoke thought. So, to summarize, serpent in Genesis is clearly the accuser, the tempter, just like in Job. And we don't have a connection unless we take the king of Tyre being consumed by Satan as Satan. Because there's scholars out there that say the king of Tyre was not consumed by Satan. And Satan's not even part of that. But if we take that, we can then connect that to being the fallen angel. We can connect it to Satan being this person who chose chaos instead of order. That he was created perfect, but he chose to again use chaos instead of good, or instead of order. There's heavy ancient Near Eastern thought being put on here. Again, it's hard to understand the Old Testament without understanding the ancient Near East because it was written then, and the cultures matter, and we know that Israel adopted cultures and habits from those cultures, and that leaks into their writings. And then we have the New Testament, which again shows us this the diabolos, which means hurl. It's the word for Satan. He's still tempting. We don't ever get a picture. We do have Jesus saying, he's the ruler of the world, the current ruler of this world who roams the world. We get that in Job still. So Jesus is making that connection. There's a lot of questions that have arisen from this first paper. And I even wrote at the bottom, I said, this paper is working, will be updated as research continues. I never got to finish it. So maybe we will finish it. We'll call this part 1. We have questions, we have connections, we have lack of connections, we have language being used throughout Scripture that is different than our understanding it of our common modern understanding of Satan. So far we don't have Satan as we understand it to be this evil thing who's the cause of all my sin. Like, he's not. You're just sinful on your own, bud. There's not a Satan behind every bush. There's not a demon behind every bush. So then we have to get into those questions like, where do demons come from? Are they the fallen angels? What does the text say? A lot of fun questions. So we'll get into it next time.